Salut, I'm Jennifer, your French teacher in the south of France. You know, in French, you learn a lot of verbs and you use some of them more than others. Réussir is a very, very commonly used verb in French. And you know, sometimes it needs to be followed with the preposition a, and other times it doesn't. So that's what this lesson is going to be about. The verb réussir can be translated lots of different ways in English because it's used in so many different ways in French. But in general, it means to succeed, to manage, or to do well. You'll see in my examples, sometimes I don't use those exact words to translate, but we're going to get to the bottom of this. When do you need to use a after réussir? We use the verb réussir without the preposition a when it is followed by a direct object. If you need a reminder about what a direct object is, I'll tell you that in just a little while. We also use the verb réussir without the preposition a when it's followed by other prepositions like dans or sans. Here we have an example using réussir followed by a direct object. J'ai réussi l'examen. J'ai réussi l'examen. What did I succeed? What did I pass? The test. I could also have said j'ai réussi mon examen. J'ai réussi cet examen. Doesn't matter. It's still a direct object because it answers the question, what? In this example, we have another direct object. Tu as bien réussi ta crème brûlée. Tu as bien réussi ta crème brûlée. You did well with your crème brûlée. What did you succeed? Your crème brûlée. So that's your direct object. Now in English, we would say you did a great job with your crème brûlée. This one also has a direct object, but this is an idiomatic expression. So it's not going to translate at all in the same way in English. Il a réussi son coup. Il a réussi son coup. Son coup is the direct object. And you see what the way I translate this in English is he pulled it off. Il a réussi son coup. And you might want me to directly translate that, but I can't. I don't know how to. I was sitting here thinking, because un coup is like a blow of some kind. It can be lots of different things. And if I told you he succeeded his blow, what does that even mean? It's idiomatic. And I think that you're probably noticing, we've only seen a few examples so far, but you're probably saying, I see that these sentences, we don't put them together exactly the same way that we do in English. C'est vrai. C'est vrai. And I'm not going to be able to give you a literal translation for this one either, but there is a direct object. Ma sœur a bien réussi sa vie. Ma sœur a bien réussi sa vie. What did my sister succeed well? Her life. What does that mean? What it means is my sister has done very well for herself. Ma sœur a bien réussi sa vie. And we do not need an a. Why? Because we have a direct object. So I'm going to tell you right now, don't always try to translate something very directly, because if you look at that sentence right there, my sister has done very well for herself, you might not even think about using the verb réussir. But that's why we're doing this lesson, so you can start using it. Here we're going to move away from the direct objects and we're going to look at the preposition dans. So we don't need that preposition, but another one can be used after the verb réussir. Elle a réussi dans sa vie personnelle et professionnelle. Elle a réussi dans sa vie personnelle et professionnelle. So we're using the preposition dans. She has thrived in her personal and professional life. We're being specific about what she succeeded in. So that's kind of cool because at least we have dans and the word in English. Earlier, we talked about someone, elle a bien réussi sa vie. And then we just stopped it right there. And that meant that she had done very well in life. But this is more, it's more specific. This is the last example I'm going to show you using the verb réussir without the preposition à, and it's just a simple question. Comment réussir sans s'épuiser? Comment réussir sans s'épuiser? So we're using the preposition sans. A little while ago, we used the preposition dans, and it means how to succeed without burning out. S'épuiser means to just really tire oneself. That's a reflexive verb. Comment réussir sans s'épuiser? So now we're going to move on to some examples in which we do need to use the preposition à. We said that we did not need to use à when réussir is followed by a direct object. But we are going to use à when réussir is followed by an indirect object or when it's followed by an infinitive. Let's begin with an infinitive. We're going to use à. J'ai réussi à comprendre. J'ai réussi à comprendre. You see the infinitive comprendre. That just means I managed to understand. So you can put réussir on your list of verbs that require à before an infinitive. Let's go with another infinitive. The infinitive is être. Max réussit toujours à être en retard. Max réussit toujours à être en retard. Your infinitive is être, and that just means Max always manages to be late. I'm going to take this opportunity to remind you that the words don't always go in the same place in French as they do in English. You see, in English, we say Max always manages, but in French, we say Max réussit toujours. And that's because toujours is one of those short, very commonly used adverbs in French. And so that means we're going to put it right after the first conjugated verb in the sentence. Now here in this example, we have an indirect object. La vie en France réussit à Roger. La vie en France réussit à Roger. And what it means, again, it's one of those, you just have to practice using the verb réussir and kind of get a grasp on all the different things that it can mean. It just means life in France is going well for Roger. So it's another one of those sentences where if you look at it and you don't know about the verb réussir, you might try to use another one and then you'll be like, oh, well, I don't know how to say that in French. Forget it. I mean, I know it happens, but yeah, get that verb réussir. I told you in the beginning, I wouldn't be doing this lesson on réussir if it were not a very important and commonly used verb. La vie en France réussit à Roger. You just have to know that if something is going well for somebody and you're using the verb réussir, then that somebody, that person is going to be an indirect object. And that's why you have to have à. So it's not so much here because réussir is your verb that you have to have an à. It is and it isn't. The real reason we have the à here is because Roger is an indirect object. So you just have to know that réussir is going to require that. This one is going to have another indirect object. Ça ne réussit pas à Stéphane de ne pas assez dormir. Ça ne réussit pas à Stéphane de ne pas assez dormir. So Stéphane is my indirect object. You see that Stéphane, he's preceded by à. Our last example said, let's see, what did it say? La vie en France réussit à Roger. Remember that one? And I said that it means life in France is going well for Roger. Okay, so I could translate this like things don't go well for Stefan when he doesn't sleep enough. Or I could translate it the way I have, it doesn't suit Stefan not to get enough sleep. So the translations are a bit loose. We can choose different words to translate these. But when something doesn't suit someone, or when something is going well for someone, that someone, using the verb réussir, that someone, that person, or those people, that's an indirect object. And so we have the a. We have another indirect object to look at, quite a different situation, and another way to use the verb réussir. Le fromage ne réussit pas bien à Léa. Le fromage ne réussit pas bien à Léa. And so, Léa, she's my indirect object. And what it means is cheese doesn't agree with Léa. I don't know what it does to her, but it doesn't agree with her. She doesn't eat it. So we use this verb réussir a lot with food. Ça ne lui réussit pas bien. Ça ne lui réussit pas bien. So remember, if Léa is my indirect object, I can replace à Léa with an indirect object pronoun. In this case, it would be lui, wouldn't it? Le fromage ne lui réussit pas. And what if you wanted to say, oh, it doesn't agree with me either? It, ça, doesn't agree with me. So me, in that case, me is the indirect object. I'm wanting you to use a pronoun, so we're going to use me. How would you say that? It doesn't agree with me either. Ça ne me réussit pas non plus. Non plus. Ça ne me réussit pas non plus. Indirect object. Ça ne me réussit pas non plus. We don't see the a anymore. Le fromage ne réussit pas bien à Léa. But if I replace à Léa with lui, the a is actually still there. It's just been replaced by lui, so you won't see it anymore. But the indirect object will remain. Le fromage ne lui réussit pas bien. Now, see, after all that business about indirect objects, you're never going to forget that you need to use an a with an infinitive, because this is the easy part, right? Here we have an infinitive for you. Je ne réussirai jamais à apprendre à skier. Je ne réussirai jamais à apprendre à skier. Apprendre is my infinitive that follows réussir. You see, I've put réussir in the future simple, just for fun. Je ne réussirai jamais à apprendre à skier. You get two a's for the price of one in this one. Well, that's because réussir, followed by an infinitive, requires a. And guess what? Apprendre, followed by an infinitive, also requires an a. So that sounds kind of neat. Je ne réussirai jamais à apprendre à skier. If you're watching this lesson in my French course for self-learners, you've certainly downloaded your study guide. You've certainly taken some notes. You've certainly written down some things that I said in the lesson that are not written in the study notes. And don't forget this, because this verb réussir is so common that it's going to come up over and over and over again within the course. And every time it does, I want you to say, oh yes, I remember why we have an a sometimes and why sometimes we don't. Now, if you don't yet have my French course for self-learners, I encourage you to check it out. Merci beaucoup et à bientôt.